Hello everyone, in today's video we're going to be taking a look at carburetor icing and carburetor heat. Now it's worth noting at this point that the way that it's modeled is going to vary from airplane to airplane. Now the aircraft I picked for this example is a Cessna 152 that's kind of default with Microsoft Flight Sim. It's a little bit difficult to trigger the carburetor icing, but of course some payware aircraft do a very, very aggressive carburetor icing. So we'll kind of walk you through it, kind of the things to watch out for and how to manage it. Let's get started. So first things first, we're here in lovely Rutland, Vermont. I was just flying up here the other day, and it is a hot and nice and humid, sticky, sticky day here. The current temperature, I believe, is about 75 degrees on the Fahrenheit scale, and of course, over humidity-wise, we're looking at about 75 to 80% humidity. Believe it or not, when you fly in the summer, this is pretty much what you're going to get if you're anywhere near any body of water. So let's go ahead and get the airplane up in the air here. Performing perfectly fine. Of course, there's no chance we're going to get like pedo icing or anything like that here. But as you can just tell, there's a lot of moisture in this air around us right now. Now, that moisture, believe it or not, because there's so much in there, is getting sucked into our engine right now, along with the air that is required for combustion. Now, one of the interesting things that happens with an aircraft is when I'm up here at full throttle, because I'm using a carburetor on this aircraft, you're basically creating what they call a venturi. And basically, if you've ever held your finger over the end of a garden hose and kind of made that high pressure situation happen, you're creating that exact situation basically inside of it. You create the squeeze it together, and then you basically going to open it back up on the other side for the purposes of helping mix the air and fuel together. It's actually neat how a carburetor works. Definitely a little bit of magic involved there. The downside to the carburetor, of course, among other things, is the fact that since we're sucking all that yummy moisture in with it, and now we're creating all sorts of pressure changes as it comes through the actual body of the venturi to mix up with that fuel, we run the risk that some of that, look at that thick air right there, some of that moisture is actually going to condense and it's going to turn into either water droplets, which is okay, it makes it a little noisy sometimes, or more frustratingly, it'll turn into ice. Now, I'm sure many of you, of course, have seen this chart before. I'll go ahead and open this one up real fast so everybody can see it. It looks a little bit like this. So basically, this is going to be the situations where the air is going to be in a position where it has enough moisture and the temperature is right to allow ice to form inside of the carburetor of your engine. Now, I don't have to get into the consequences of having ice block the airflow of the stuff coming in from outside, but you can imagine if that were to occur to you, you would find yourself with a massive reduction in power that could cause really, really big problems, especially if you're down here on approach like this. So I'm going to go ahead and now back the throttle up here. I've got plenty of room as far as lining myself up right here. Now, let me go ahead and now activate my little carburetor sensor gauge here. Now, a lot of people are going to be asking me, wait, where did you get that from? That's actually part of Air Manager. We covered that in another video. But one of the fun things you can do with it is you can actually use it to basically show extra instruments if you need to do something. Now, what I like to do is put like a little attitude ball right there, so when you're doing pattern work, you can just look down to check your attitude real fast. So you'll notice in the real world, of course, when I start pulling this throttle back, what you would actually see is that carburetor heat temperature would start to drop. But unfortunately, they didn't model that particular aspect of this like that, which is, it's kind of a shame because that's exactly what we're worried about. Now, if I were to push the throttle forward in the real world, since I'm not choking the air off as much, that pressure drop wouldn't be, you wouldn't be creating as aggressive as a vacuum because of the way the throttle's set up. So you would actually go ahead and watch the temperature increase. So I'm going to go ahead and I'll leave my engine completely on idle here. It's a Cessna 152, what's going to happen. Now, in the real world, what's going to start happening here is we're going to slowly start to build up that ice inside that carburetor. Now, in the real world, I've encountered carburetor icing on multiple occasions. It's just something that happens this time of year. People think it's not possible because it's hot outside. Actually, it's worse because there's more moisture. If it was hot and there's no moisture, you'd never have a problem with carburetor ice. But the reality is, if it's a nice, moist, warm day like this, you're going to have plenty of very, very humid air going into your engine, making things very grumbly. So what would start to happen normally as you start to build up ice inside your carburetors, you'd have a decrease in RPM. One of the things that disguises that decrease in RPM, of course, is the fact we're on descent. So if I were to pull my nose up like this, and just to slow that engine down just a little bit. Now, if I had really, really bad icing, like these conditions would lend themselves to, if I push that throttle forward, I'd get to about 1500 RPM, and then the engine would immediately cut out. Not cut out, it would start going as it starts sucking in little pieces of ice directly into the engine itself. And you hope, and you really hope, your engine does not completely choke off because of the ice, because if that happens, of course, your engine stops. And there are very, very few ways to remedy that situation if that actually were to happen to you. So the next issue, of course, is, well, obviously, we've known about this carburetor problem for a very, very long time. What do we do to remedy it? Well, we use something called carburetor heat. So if I come down here, you'll notice a little handle directly next to my throttle right here. This is anti-ice engine. If I grab that and pull that out, watch what happens to my carburetor temperature. You'll notice that it spikes. What you're actually doing when you pull that handle out in this particular aircraft is you're bypassing the air filter and sucking air into the engine, basically around the warm parts of the engine. This now means, of course, because you're pulling in such hotter air, there's just no chance that you're going to get ice if the temperature is 30 degrees Celsius right there. It's just not going to happen. Now, the interesting thing with this carburetor ice is heat, I should say, is if you're in a situation where, for example, I have to go around, if I were to give it full power, my aircraft is not going to want to produce full power. You're going, wait, what? Why? Well, take a look. My temperature right now is 30 degrees Celsius coming into here, which is very, very high. That also means my mixtures actually become enriched. You're like, but you haven't touched the red handle. What are you talking about? Well, remember, warm air is less dense than cold air. That means that now that we're at this higher temperature here, my engine's actually not going to be producing the same amount of horsepower. So let's say we have ice in the engine, we realize it, and we have to go around, and we have the carburetor icing on all at the same time, anti-ice all at the same time. We'd now run into a situation where not only are we choked off because of ice, but we're also running into a situation where we're barely producing any power for the purposes of climbing. Of course, our bigger problem with climbing right now is the fact our flaps are all the way down. Oh, it's a Cessna 152. It's just going to mush. Yeah, so you can see right now, we have a significant decrease in power here. That is just typical because remember, that air is a lot less dense. We're just not going to produce it, and we have too much fuel going into it. I know there are people out there who says, well, technically you could go like that and get a little bit of a boost of power with the anti-ice on. Sure, but do you want to be doing that many different things at one time? Not to mention when you're in takeoff power, it's generally not recommended to be going too lean on the power. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and I'll shove that anti-ice back in. You can see that the carburetor temperature gauge went whoop, right back down because now we're pulling in the regular ambient air, and you can see just how humid it is today directly out the front. So the question becomes, when should you use carburetor anti-icing technology? The key thing there is you want to use it whenever you're in situations where you're at reduced power. Now, some people say, well, what do you mean by reduced power? Like, what did you do? Well, in flight training, we almost always use our carburetor heat whenever we were in situations where we had to approach to a landing. Now, some people, of course, say, well, what if we're in a situation where it's in the middle of the winter? Do we really need the carburetor heat? Based on practice, it's just a matter of, again, habit. Keeping that habit going is what's going to keep you safe. So what I recommend doing is, like I was saying, every time you have the power that goes underneath the green arc that you see indicated here, I would recommend putting the carburetor heat on. Now, generally, when we're flying a pattern like this, we're not going to be spending a lot of time in under the green arc there. Now, if I wanted to do an approach to a landing, I go ahead and pull my throttle back. You can see that I pull myself under that green arc immediately. If that occurs, I would recommend immediately turning on the carb ice, regardless of what time of year it actually is. Now, there's another interesting problem that carburetor heat creates. And I'll go ahead and start slowly spiraling in the general direction of the runway here. And that's what happens is because you're bypassing the air filter on the carburetor, or the engine, I should say, you're going to be creating an interesting situation where if there are any particulates, you could potentially suck them directly into your engine because there's nothing protecting your engine from those particulates. That means if you're doing some kind of a soft field landing, you basically are going to have to disengage your carburetor heat before you make contact with the ground. Or if you're doing a soft field takeoff, you're going to have to disable it as well because of the fact that, like I was saying, you don't want to be sucking in anything into the engine that doesn't belong there, kind of a thing like that. So we're just going to kind of come around with our normal approach. And of course, one of the things I always forget, and one of the things that you got to be really careful with, is when you do have to go around, push both these handles in at the same time. One of the nice advantages, and I love this about Cessnas, is they chose to put those handles next to each other, which means when you need to go around, you just push everybody forward at the same time, and then you can go ahead and begin your go-around process. Now, the next question, of course, is going to be, what about fuel-injected engines? Now, fuel-injected engines typically don't have issues with icing. It's just not the same kind of motion that could potentially lead to that particular scenario that we saw a little bit earlier. There are a couple very, very ultra-rare situations where it is possible to get icing in those, but for the most part, they're not even equipped with anti-icing material or technology on board for that explicit purpose. One other question everybody asks, of course, too, is if we're in a cloud and it's icing conditions, should we be using carburetor heat? The answer is yeah, definitely. If you're in a situation where there's actual ice, like the kind that actually freezes on the plane, we also need to keep in mind that could get stuck into our engine, which could cause all sorts of nastiness. Don't forget after landing on the ground, by the way, to go ahead and disengage your carburetor heat. We don't need that running because, like I said, it does bypass the air filter. Enjoy.